Welcome back to the second half of this plenary session. As I was saying earlier, the next speaker was a top-rated speaker at NPC a couple of years ago. He really takes the time to give back to the community. And the last time he was here, he spoke about the unique culture at his company, InMobi. So we're very, very happy to have Naveen Tewari back with us. And he's going to be interviewed by Govindraj Ethiraj of Ping Digital. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, NASSCOM, for inviting me here. Hello, Naveen.
Hi. And the bottle is branded. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I think it's amazing.
NASSCOM's getting smarter.
All about advertising.
So, we had a little chat before we came here, as all speakers do. So what I thought I'll do is, this discussion is supposed to be about the Nimble Way, right? So now InMobi is not a new company. It's been around for about 8 or 9 years. So I thought one of the interesting things would be, if you are a manager, entrepreneur, aspiring entrepreneur, is to understand what is this company going through today and what is the team doing about it, including in the context of the opportunities they're facing, the challenges, the threats, and what are the strengths that they bring to the table. Are those the same strengths that they had in the beginning? Do those strengths even matter? And how are they really coping in this environment? And how are they, in some senses, trying to make sure that they remain as relevant and successful in the next few years as they were perhaps in the last few years? So that's really the broad ambit of what I'm going to do. It's a 30-minute discussion, so there's not much time. So I'm going to go a little fast, and hopefully in about 15 or 20 minutes, I'll try and throw it open for questions if you have any. And it'll be great to see what your questions are and how you are seeing maybe the discussion develop. So, Naveen, before we begin, let me ask you, I asked a couple of people about your business. Now, I didn't do a survey, but most of them didn't understand actually what you do. They said that it's a great company.
I also have a tough time, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a unicorn. But I said, yeah, but what does it do? So they said, it's in something to do with advertising. So why don't you explain to us what exactly you do, and then we'll talk about how you do it and what are some of the things that are going on in your company.
By the way, just before I begin, just listening to your questions, I know I have a board meeting coming up, but I didn't realize that they actually shifted it here. Because all your questions are nothing but what the board asks you, and especially the Q4 board meeting, exactly like this. What are you going to do the next 3 years? Anyway, we'll try to talk about some of those. Look, we are in the business of advertising, as 3 people that you talked to did answer. It's very simple. I think the world has a lot of media that gets created, whether you take traditional media like newspapers, etc. Which the real price of a single newspaper is about 10 to 15 rupees. We only end up paying about a couple of rupees for it. The rest of it is essentially subsidized through advertising. So, advertising plays a massive role in subsidizing a lot of content consumption in the world. We essentially try to pioneer that in the mobile space, and we do that for all mobile content that essentially is available out there. It's also very interesting because, and I think I was sharing this with you, backstage, some of the world's largest companies are basically advertising led. So if you take about $200 billion or $100 billion plus companies, probably half of them are essentially built on advertising. So whether you take, Google and Facebook, you take, Tencent, Baidu, take Alibaba, you can even take Amazon to a great extent. A lot of those companies and many, many more are largely built on advertising. And I think in India we do lack companies which are built on advertising. On the top of my head, I think whether it's one of the TV channels or traditional media companies are the only ones that are essentially built on advertising, but none of the truly speaking online companies have really figured out how advertising should happen. And it's also, you can also see that in the size of the mobile ad market, it kind of goes hand in hand. The mobile ad market, by the way, globally would be $50 billion plus, but in India, it's only like 0.5% of it, about $100 million. So, you kind of have that disconnect also with regards to not just understanding of the advertising businesses and its whole value chain, but also what it can do for businesses.
Right. So what are the touch points for consumers? I mean, so I'm consuming, and I'm sure I'm experiencing, or I think I'm experiencing some of your products or services. Where are those touch points? At what points do I encounter them? And what are the probability that I'm encountering something is being delivered by you?
So if you take India as an example, I think um, any, any content that you're consuming, you don't pay for it in most of the cases, would necessarily have some kind of an advertising system running behind it. And that advertising system, if you were to take India, probably 20% of the probability would be that it will come through us. On everyday basis, to about 130 million people, we show about 8 or 9 ads every day. And if you are part of those 130 million people who use smartphones on a daily basis, then you have a decently high probability that you would have seen something coming from us.
And how do those ads come to me? Are you the engine which is collecting those ads on a tech platform, or do you have a sales team which goes out?
It's actually both. So we work across the supply chain of advertising. We have technology that developers and anyone who has a business who wants to use advertising to make money from and monetize their traffic, they will take that technology from us. We then have an engine in the middle which will essentially ensure that what you're being shown is somewhat relevant. And then there is a team at the back end which essentially goes and talks to all the advertisers and say, hey, in India I have 130 million people who you could segment and break into smaller buckets, and then kind of reach out to them with your message. By the way, today I believe certainly this is true in China, and I think it's starting to become true in India. If you really want to build a bigger brand, you need to be on mobile, because mobile video consumption is just going through the roof. Almost about 10x growth in this last 6 to 9 months on mobile video in India itself, where the networks are pretty pathetic. Despite that, the mobile video consumption is really, really fast. So if one wants to really build a brand and reach out to more number of users, you are better off doing that on mobile than on any other platform today.
Right. So walk us through the context, right? So we are saying Indian mobile or Indian digital advertising market is roughly $1 billion.
Correct.
7 to 8,000 crores. Of which Google and Facebook control about 80%?
60% probably.
60%, okay.
Yeah.
Now, what is left? There is the 40% that's left. Where do you play and how do you play?
In the 40%, so there is a large part that goes to search, by the way, in that. What's left outside of search is exactly where we go in and we talk to the advertisers and we take a decent chunk of that remaining pie.
Right, so when you say you take a chunk of it, so if I'm the advertiser and let's say I'm a consumer product brand, I'm a soap, right? Yep. So I advertise. So what do you deliver and what do you keep with you and what's your earning?
So what we tell the person who is selling soap is, hey, if you really want to reach out to a targeted segment of 25 million people over a day, and you can do that on multiple days, you should use our platform. So they do that. They use us, Facebook, Google in some proportion, combination, however they feel, to reach out to these many mobile users who are spending a lot of time, almost of the total media time that is spent by any consumer today, about 63% of that mobile media time is spent on mobile, average across India. So now he spends money with us. We take that money and we then reach out to those users because we have partners who have given us real estate in their applications or in their mobile websites, where we would reach out to you as a consumer and show you those ads. What ends up happening, we keep about 40% of those $100 somebody gave us, and we give 60% to the developer or whoever owns the media.
Right, so at a 40% margin, then you should be a very successful business, or at least you should be profitable, but that was not the case until very recently, or it's not even the case till now.
No, that's the case now, okay. For the last 6 months for sure.
So why does it take so long to make money? I mean, for a business that keeps 40% in margins.
Well, we are a global company, so we invested a lot in building global sales forces, which does not take away the fact that, why can you not be successful or making money earlier? We could have made money earlier. I think the idea of making money, there are two parts to this question, right? So one is, as an entrepreneur, when you start off, you say, hey, I want to invest more and more into newer platforms and newer technologies because that could give me the next 3-4 curves, and you continuously, keep experimenting, and you invest towards that. Then you reach a time when you know that you've reached a certain scale and stage, and you say, all right, I'm going to curb down on some of those experiments because I now need to make money, and as soon as you decide, at 40% margin business, it takes you less than a quarter to be able to do so.
But a 40% margin, I'm going to come back to that point in a moment, but at a 40% margin business is also the kind of business where you have 20 other people jumping in, isn't it?
Huh? So repeat your question. I was just, you talked too much about the 40% ad too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying if I see someone doing a 40% margin business, I would
Yeah,
be
no,
tempted
absolutely.
to
Look,
jump into.
if you go globally, right, so it's a
Yeah.
very interesting point. So if you go globally, and a lot of the venture capitalists and investment bankers might be sitting here, ad tech is a beaten world right now, especially in the last 2-3 years or so, because of the exact same thing that, it's mobile advertising per se, by the way, is expected to be about $250 billion market globally today. And
Of about $700 billion
of
total
about that going to about 800 billion.
Total
Of about
advertising
$800 billion, $250 billion would be just mobile. That's why you see companies like Google and Facebook obviously going crazy on it, and companies like Verizon spending $9.5 billion to buy assets which are nothing but ad tech assets. Now, the reason why people were beating it down a little bit, or a lot, by the way, was because it's actually pretty easy to kick off an ad tech business, but it's extremely hard to actually scale one. So if one were to look at United States and say, hey, how many ad tech companies exist there, the number would be probably 500 to 1,000. But then you actually take a cut and say, okay, how many of them are above $100 million? That 1,000 boils down to like 20. Now you take a different cut. You take, okay, outside of the US, how many of the companies who have outside of the US and outside of China for a second, how many companies exist? That 1,000 comes down to 200 anyway. You take a $100 million cut on it, that list is less than 10. You go to China and you say, hey, how many Chinese ad tech companies exist? There were like 300 to 400 companies there. You take a $100 million cut, there are 5. And that's how one needs to look at this. But because most of the ad tech is not well understood outside of the US, the emotions of ad tech are actually driven off from there. And that's absolutely okay with us.
Can you define that when you say emotions of ad tech?
Emotions that ad tech is a pretty beaten world right now is actually driven more from a US-centric view of the world as against the global-centric view of the world, which is also okay because we've been actually playing this game long enough to know how the world evolution would happen on this. We think on a $250 billion market, even if Google, Facebook put together take about 50 to 60% of the market, that leaves about 40% of the market of $250 billion. That's about a $100 billion market that's left out there for you to do whatever you want to do with it.
So let me ask you differently, right? So someone like you has raised venture capital. So does venture capital, when you look back, spoil you?
Spoil?
Yeah, I mean, you invest where perhaps you shouldn't be investing.
Look, I think a lot of these are very interesting statements to make post facto.
Yeah,
because you can always say, hey, I shouldn't have invested here, but of all the places that one has invested in, there are maybe even 20% of them even work out. That's actually a brilliant position to be in. So I actually think, yes, it does have a tendency of spoiling because you do certain wrong things. For example, investing in newer ideas and newer areas of growth, I don't think is that bad. I think where the mistake is made is when you actually go down and you overhire. And you actually start building out these massive org structures that you learned in business schools to essentially say that this is how it should be. I think those are areas which are completely wasteful. And that slows the organization down against anything else. I think if you were to essentially grow bigger, you need to have the ethos of your startup that you had at the beginning of it, but just at a larger scale with more number of such things happening. I think that's where we all make mistakes. Like I think people take a lot of pride, and you kind of get your ego boosted when media also reports these things to say, hey, oh wow, they're growing by 300 people like a quarter or something like that. So, and I think that's
so what
just
happens
absurd.
when you read that? You say, okay, now I'm going to go and hire another 300, or
no, it's a very internal ego boost that happens. It shouldn't happen, but you're also decently young and you don't know what the world really is, and so you get excited, you hire more people, and then you mess it up.
So you've obviously had some exits, and depending on who you believe, it has either a lot of exits or some exits. But what's your sense? I mean, why do these exits happen? Is it because there's a culture problem? I was reading today that the CFO of Flipkart has quit. Now, I wonder, as a journalist, why would someone quit a company with an $11 billion market capitalization? Surely there's more lying there to be taken away than somewhere else, or maybe even without a job.
Yeah, and as a journalist, then you would write, hey, something's wrong with Flipkart.
As an extension, yes, yeah.
But that's, I don't know what the answer is. I know they're my neighbors, but I don't know what the answer is. But, a lot of times, by the way, so there were reports that came about us to say we are having, senior people exit. And then I looked at my senior people and I said, okay, I've had one senior exit in the last 18 months. and still the media wrote that. So you need to build enough tendency to, ignore those things. Yet,
But it seems like more than one. I mean, an article I read on May 26, 2016. It says your CFO, VP of Engineering, VP of Finance.
they're all there, by the way.
Okay. So they didn't quit?
They didn't quit.
Okay.
But who wrote the article?
May 26,
it?
2016, Economic Times. Yeah.
Ah, there you are.
Don't believe that what you read in the papers?
I don't know. Look at the people, ask them.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
Now, less number of people tend to believe them, actually, but that's different. I actually think, by the
Hindu,
way,
April 7 talked about series of layoffs.
they copied from ET.
Okay. The Hindu article came before the ET one. So
One copied from the other.
Okay,
That's okay. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Look, it bothers you because you have to stand up on the stage in your own town hall and talk about it to say, hey, guys, really you think these people left us? They're sitting right across the table from us. And then people look around and say, okay, fine, no problems. But, it does create some challenges. Look, let's be very clear about it because a lot of times, by the way, media creates interesting perception.
both ways.
Both ways. And when you are a very small startup, they give you an ego boost of a very different nature, which is amazing. And by the way, so I think it swings like this, right? So media has to have high TRP. I get it. Everyone gets it. But so either you have to have an amazing story of success or an amazing story of failure. You have to be one of the two. Frankly, the world is neither of these two. Frankly, the world is somewhere in between. Yeah, I know, look, things get messed up, in which company doesn't get messed up. But it also is never that, you're hitting every shot for a six.
Tata Sons.
There you are,
Yeah.
right? So, how would you always have, hitting 6 sixes in over, right? It doesn't happen. But that's what the media on its positive would write, and then you'll say you'll have hat tricks of getting bowled out. Neither of those things are happening. They're rare. I think that our job is to essentially say, okay, look, let's be a little more pragmatic about these things. By the way, just on this whole point that you brought out about senior people leaving, etc. A lot of times, look, a lot of us have a tendency of, and not just a tendency, you can actually go and hire people. In India specifically, and especially, you will hire people from traditional companies. And a lot of those companies come from a very different culture, background, and processes and systems that are never even existing at some of our companies and some of these companies. And it takes them a lot of time to actually shift from that world to this world. Many of times they're able to make that shift, and many of times they're not. Now, when someone is not able to make that shift, it's better for both not to kind of coexist. But obviously, you never want to tarnish anyone's image by saying, like what happened with Tata Sons, that we fired him. You don't actually want to go out and say that. You just, you kind of part ways.
You separate gently. But, but my question is, what do you do? So a CFO, for instance, I mean, I can understand the entrepreneur, that's you, who obviously comes from a technology background, can drive a lot of things. But the CFO is a slightly more evolved position. I mean, the ability to go and talk to bankers, the ability to go and do...
I don't think
is that something that... No, I'm asking. I mean, is that something that you can sort of be as adept at if you were fresh out of college?
No, not fresh out of college, but there are people who come from different backgrounds, and you just have to choose the right set of people. I think experience is overrated, and so therefore,
so Google had Eric Schmidt, right? He came from Novell, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, he already had a job. He was, and most companies, even at an advanced entrepreneurial stage, would in many cases bring in, professionals, quote unquote.
Oh, absolutely. By the way, you should bring in professionals. I just think the ability to transition from a different culture to this culture is the biggest reason of why people leave companies. I'm actually not saying you shouldn't bring people from traditional backgrounds. You should. But this transition, and one should basically figure out how that transition should happen, or if it's happening or not. I think the question is against the media reports to say, hey, is there something wrong with the company? And that's not necessarily the biggest of the reasons. The biggest of the reasons is, hey, the transition wasn't being able to made, and therefore it's time to part ways. And generally, you'll never know this in 3 months or 6 months. It'll probably take you 1 to 2 years to figure this out.
So if you were to look at your team today, do you think you have the best fit in terms of people? And we're really saying we're talking about being nimble, we're talking about a company that's already been around for some time. Is this the best team in terms of skills, people, background, cultural fit for the next 3 years, which is clearly going to be more challenging than the last 3?
I have a very simple framework of hiring and keeping people in the organization. It's called ASS, ASS. It's basically for attitude, um, attitude, smarts, and skills. So skills is least important for me. Attitude is most important. The reason why those people exist at the company and they stay for a longest period of time is because of the attitude. And if that is there, then you can solve for any problem. Like none of us, by the way, in startups are building a rocket that needs to go to Mars or anything like that. We're solving simple logical problems that people with decent smartness can actually solve. As long as you understand and believe in the vision of the company and understand that, look, this is where we can take it to. That's why we have a massive policy and a very, very hard bar of getting people from outside, especially at mid to senior level, especially at senior level. We like to make people within the organization to grow. Long time ago, I never understood this. When you talk of some of the best companies in the world, GE as an example, who would build people within the organization. I see a lot of value in that. And I see this because when there are people who have grown within the organization and they take those senior level positions, the organization feels excited about it to say, hey, I can also get there and not necessarily have to leave jobs and then move up. Like today's generation and the system that's existing out there essentially forces you to essentially switch jobs in order to move up the ladder, which is pretty sad because it's not good for anyone in the system. So therefore, we have a very, almost to a level of policy to say, hey, we need to look for people internally and make them come into the organization.
Could someone take your job?
Absolutely.
In how much time?
If I were to give somebody at my own company today.
Okay. And what would be?
And there'll be a fight for it because I think there are 3 or 4 people who can take it.
Wonderful. So, and would the same ASS attributes apply to this person?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why they're in the company at the senior level management, by the way. That's exactly the reason why they should exist there.
Right. So let's talk about, as we close, let's talk about the next couple of years, right? Mm-hmm. So we are talking about a situation where obviously there's not enough capital, but coupled with your own realization that you don't need perhaps so much capital, and capital is not the way to go. Mm-hmm. How is your growth path looking like? And if you can share some numbers, that would be really useful.
So I think look, I think as an organization, every organization evolves. And I used that framework previously at one of my talks. I think any company, any startup goes through the phase of a T20 to a 1 day to a test match. In a T20, you can be reckless, lose as many wickets as possible, you can still win the game. At 1 day, you can still lose some wickets, but you still have to be little planned and you can still make it. When you get to a test match phase, you have to play session by session, you have to hold your wickets, and you have to basically make a systemic long-term plan in order to win the game. I think that's the phases in which we have all gone. The only challenge is when you play a T20, it's announced it's T20. When you play a 1 day, it's announced it's a 1 day. When you play a test match, it's announced it's a test match. Unfortunately for a startup, you go through a continuum here. You just don't know when you have stopped playing T20 and when you have started playing 1 day. You don't know when you've stopped playing 1 day and you've started playing test match.
So what are you playing right now?
Test match.
Okay.
And so that's why we can't lose wicket. Losing wicket is like spending money which is not yours. And therefore, at some point of time, you realize I shouldn't be spending this money because I think I can build, because I have 40% margin, I think I can build a decent enough self-sustainable business of my own. And therefore, you make hard calls about things that you should do and things you shouldn't do, hard calls about prioritization. Look, when you make hard calls, it's blood on the table. It has to be blood on the table. If it's not blood on the table, that means you're not making hard enough calls. And I think when you get to this zone, by the way, this zone when you're recklessly losing wickets and you're trying to hit few sixes, etc., it's very exciting. Media loves it. Everyone loves it. It's a fairy tale story. It's brilliantly covered. When you get here, it is boring. And it should be boring. It is all about execution, execution, execution. You need to be asking same questions again and again. You should not be trying to do new things. You should be basically building business on what's existed in the company and grow systematically. That's boring for people. This is exciting. And I think that's the change which essentially starts to happen. And I think India as a country probably hasn't seen this complete cycle for startups. And therefore, when you move from this exciting phase to a slightly less exciting, it's all okay for a lot of the people. But once you're in this test match phase, people need to actually appreciate how execution needs to happen and how systemic planning needs to happen for a lot of the companies that are actually entering this phase and are playing that game.
And you're also, I'm assuming, telling people who are starting out that, remember that there's going to be a test match around the corner. And you can't be playing.
I actually ask them to win that play that they're playing right now. Because that's also important to win. Because unless you win the T20, you're not going to play 1 day. Then you have to win the 1 day, and then you have to do this. I just think that transition when somebody is making, there needs to be people to say that, look, there is a transition happening, and therefore something else is needed. It should not be external factors, like it's been for a lot of us, where external factors force us to realize that, oh, we are playing test matches. That's not something that should
What's
happen.
an external factor, for example?
For example, to say, hey, can I go get more funding? Hey, wait a second. People are going to look at your EBITDA and a multiplier of the EBITDA, therefore, but I don't have an EBITDA. So how will you multiply anything to it, right? So, therefore, those are forcing factors for you to essentially go and build a different kind of a business. And those transitions are not necessarily pointed out by people who have done it in the past, but you have to internally figure it out, so therefore you're going to make a few mistakes in that.
Right, so last question. So do you like what you're doing?
I love what I do.
And do you see yourself doing it for a while?
Yeah.
And you were telling me that...
Unless this board meeting...
You
asked me too many questions.
So you said that, we were talking about this, you said that people don't understand advertising in this country, and except for a couple of people. So are you going to, is that something that you want to evangelize as well, in addition to...
No. I don't want to evangelize advertising. Look, the people who need to spend on advertising, they get it. Evangelization is a function of, when bigger companies are built on it. They will create self-evangelization. For example, look, we are one of the largest advertising platforms in China. Everyone knows us. We don't have to ever explain and put up a slide when we go into any meeting in China to say what InMobi does. Because market has evolved itself, given,
So when I talk about people understanding advertising, I'm thinking consumers. I think you're thinking venture capitalists.
Yeah, so look, there is no reason for us to explain this to consumers.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, like, what's the point of explaining that to consumers? Sure. We don't need it. We love the fact that we are a B2B company, and that's an easier play to be in.
Right. We've run out of time. Thank you so much, and thank you, NASSCOM, for inviting me. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.